Recent CNN polls, 86% of Americans think our government is broken. 75% of Americans think government officials are dishonest.
We don't have democracy in this country. It's so biased. If you're in a third party, I can't get in debates as a third party candidate. When I did it as a third party, I spent over half my money just trying to get on the ballots. So we don't have a good democratic process. What happens if you come to the conclusion, as millions of Americans have, the parties aren't different? They're all the same. The monetary policy stays the same. The welfare system stays the same. The foreign policy stays the same. They get pretty disgusted. So there is but one party.
I mean, it wouldn't have been any better off, and it wouldn't have been worse off. It would have been the same policies. Obama has followed McCain's policy in the Middle East. He's expanding the war, sending more troops to Afghanistan, bombing back Pakistan, taking on Yemen, and threatening Iran, and that's exactly what McCain would have done.
A wave election is a sort of extraordinary election where you can have one or both houses of Congress change parties. Or you can have a significant number of seats change hands. Usually you have one every 3, 4, 5 elections every 2 years, but we've now had 3 in a row, and from 2006, 2008, 2010, 3 consecutive wave elections in a row. Yeah, I think a lot of it's discontent. I think people right now are fed up with both parties. There's a real anti-incumbent streak that exists.
No change at all. It's the same old stuff. The change is occurring, though, but it's changing in the country. The people are waking up. The Tea Party movement is significant. The college campuses are changing. The organizations that have been formed to try to change this country. So there's tremendous changes going on in the country, and I place a lot of hope in the next generation because they're very interested in this subject. But Congress, the same old stuff. It goes on and on.
If you come to the conclusion that Republicans and Democrats aren't too much different from each other, then there are no choices. We don't have really good democracy in this country.
But, a lot of people voted for the president because he had indicated maybe he would have a different foreign policy. And I think they're very disappointed because he has expanded the wars rather than diminishing them.
If you look at actual policies, decisions that have to be implemented or are being implemented right now as opposed to promises of what they'll do in the future. When it comes to Iraq, probably many people who voted for President Obama thought that he was going to get into office and end this war now. Instead, what President Obama and his team did was ratify the withdrawal plan that President Bush and General Petraeus had developed. Take Pakistan. This has been a major emphasis and certainly was a major campaign emphasis of President Obama. But if you look at the details of what he's proposing, or actually not what he's proposing, but what he has set in motion, what he has approved, those are largely the plans and trajectory that the Bush team had established.
He talked about change, and nothing has changed. The Republicans, of course, when they are out of office, they want change too, and yet, when we had our chance 10 years ago to get in and make a difference, not much happened.
This makes me nervous. I mean, that nothing ultimately is going to be done, and we're going to be living with this problem forever, and it's going to get to a situation that's unmanageable. We're pretty close, it feels like. I mean, will it be the constituents of the lawmakers in Washington that finally put their foot down and people start listening to the public, or is that not even going to happen?
Well, I think the people would respond if they knew the facts and if they'd been told the truth, but they haven't been. They've been lied to for the last 10 or 20 years by both sides.
I would argue that leadership in the last 10 years have drifted from Republican principles: deficit financing, big government, more taxes, more bureaucracy, more regulations, more entitlements, policing the world. But that's not what we stand for.
So far, most of them represent the status quo, and not any. I think they're shifting a little bit because of the political pressure. But who's saying bring all the troops home? Who's saying that we need sound money and we ought to believe in the Constitution? Who wants to get rid of the Patriot Act? Who believes in property rights? They're going to modify their position, but they represent the status quo. And this is what excites so many people now. They're sick of the status quo.
What's the sense of having a convention if everything is decided? And it's sort of a shame the taxpayers help pay for these conventions, but it's nothing more than a show. And we're trying to say that we have a right to argue our case that the Republicans ought to stand for something. And they used to, and I'd like to see that happen again.
According to a new Rasmussen poll, only 17% of likely American voters believe the current federal government has the consent of the governed, a value outlined in the Declaration of Independence and for which arguably the revolution was fought.
Well, you know, we track this on a regular basis along with other measures of the health of our democracy and our economy and the political system. And this indicator has been getting consistently worse. What it measures is a general distrust of the political process. It's not Barack Obama and the Democrats or George Bush and the Republicans. Both parties have worked together on a bipartisan basis for decades to completely alienate the American people.
Scott Rasmussen, do your polls show you that this number of those who feel they have no control over the government is growing each year?
Absolutely. In fact, just today we released some numbers showing that just 43% now believe that elections are fair to voters, the lowest number we've ever recorded. The 17% who say we have the consent of the governed, that's the lowest ever. No matter how we ask the question, no matter what way we're approaching it, we're finding record-setting dissatisfaction. And Judge, the reason is pretty, we can talk about politics and tactics and speeches, but here's a simple fact. For the last 4 or 5 decades, every presidential candidate has promised to cut spending and taxes. Just about every congressional candidate has promised to do the same. But the last time government spending in America went down was 1954.
Wow.
I mean, so there's no connection between what people are voting for and what the end result is. That's the disconnect, and we see it in issue after issue.
Might this yearning for control over the government and this perception of a disconnect between the governed and the government explain the rise of candidates like Ron Paul and the rise of his end the Fed and don't spend more money than you take in attitude? And might those attitudes be flourishing, like you found, I think, recently in your last poll in Iowa?
Well, yes, it does fuel the rise of candidates like that, and I think we read too much into it if we say it's a particular ideology. It is a frustration. In 2006, they vote against the party in power. They do it again in 2008. They do it again in 2010, and nothing happens. So people are looking for somebody who can deliver.
You said that Obama is simply recycling Bush's plans when it comes to bank reform.
The essence of the Obama, Summers, Geithner programs are not all that different from the Bush-Paulson programs.
Doesn't this go against everything that Obama promised about changing and fixing Washington?
It's vacuous rhetoric. I mean, elections in the United States are essentially run by the public relations industry. The financial industries, since neoliberalism, have become overwhelmingly important in the United States and the world, in fact. So yes, they were brought in to fix up the crisis they created. And of course, they're going to fix it up so that the institutional structures remain the same.
What you're describing doesn't necessarily sound like a democracy, like a functioning, healthy democracy.
It's not a functioning, healthy democracy. In fact, there's a very substantial split between a gap between public opinion and public policy.
The Democratic Party gets a lot of its support from the very interest that when the Republicans are in power, financially support the Republicans. You really have two corporate parties who are, in their own way, in their own time, serving the interest of basically a narrow set of economic interest in the country, who, as Glenn Greenwald, who's a great analyst and journalist, wrote just this week, those narrow interests seem to win, determine the outcomes. No matter how many Democrats are elected, no matter who has their hands on the lever of power, these narrow interests determine the outcomes, even when they have to run, in Washington, even when they have to run roughshod over the interest of ordinary people. And I'm sad to say that's happened